It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. So we've made it to October, and for this spooky month of episodes, I wanted to finally get to what many classic horror fans deem the definitive portrayal of Count Dracula. It's time to finally get into the Christopher Lee cycle of Hammer Film Productions' Dracula series. For this whole month, I'll be looking at Lee's first 4 turns in that role, beginning right here with Horror of Dracula. In all, Lee played Dracula a whole bunch, probably more than he could have really ever wanted. That said, he's undeniably menacing as the character, and as I just said, what a large number of horror fans think of the moment they hear the name Dracula. Perhaps the most important thing that Lee did was repair a somewhat tarnished image for the Count. That image was strong and powerful when Bela Lugosi played the character in 1931, but in the 27 years in between that Universal film and the 1958 film we're going to talk about this week, the character had sort of degraded a bit into a kind of a partial B-movie staple, or just kind of a silly and, for a lack of a better term, toothless villain. But Lee made the character terrifying again. But there's a little bit more to it than that. He also brought this dark, brooding sexuality to the role. And this is a particularly interesting time in film. Here in America, films were strictly monitored by censoring bodies. Nothing could be too sexy or too violent or too gory. However, Hammer, for at least a short period of time, did something else. They almost turned all those things up and were able to get away with it somehow, at least for a few years. Maybe someday I'll go on a protracted rant about Britain's Mary Whitehouse and her crusade against anything deemed unsuitable for societal consumption, particularly as she was kind of starting to do this in the late 70s and into the 80s. But let's just say that Britain has had some weird feelings about their entertainment over the years. Hammer, though, well, they made sure that every woman's bustier was uplifting and their corsets kept things right up in full view. Especially in the later half of the 60s and into the 70s, they did this. And that's what Dracula has always kind of been about, right? Vampirism has a lot of fans due to the mixture of pain and pleasure. Almost having the id in full control thanks to the combination of hunger, the feeling of invulnerability, and the sexualization of how intimate you become with your victims. And Hammer took that and really ran with it for a little while. Hell, they even did that with some of their other horror movies in the 60s, like the Frankenstein series, and then in the 70s with the Karnstein trilogy. And you can see one of the earliest Monster Mondays where I discussed the vampire lovers. But where did Hammer Film come from? Now, don't worry, we've got a whole month of Chris Lee to delve deeper into his catalog of work and life. But I wanted to start with Hammer Film Productions, and they started in late 1934 and was founded by William Hines. They did not start off as a horror studio. If you remember back to when I last did some Universal Classics, the mid-30s weren't a particularly great time for horror. It was considered cheap and lower brow. The moment Hines founded Hammer, though, the private life of Henry IX went right into production. And to show how solid this new company could be, the film became the first ever British movie to be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. And he had a pretty good relationship with a distribution company called Exclusive. However, Hammer did not survive a slump in the British film industry, and it had to go into bankruptcy and liquidation just within a few years of its founding. However, a man by the name of James Carreras, a British film producer of his own right, joined Exclusive in 1938. And not only that, but Hines' own son, Anthony Hines, worked for the distributor too. But both Anthony and Carreras went off to fight in World War II. Upon conclusion of the war, Carreras returned to Exclusive, which just so happened to stay in business in a very limited capacity. And they were able to start back up the Hammer arm of the company by acquiring cheap rights to some BBC radio stuff to be able to make some movies. By 1949, Carreras, along with his father Enrique and the two Hines, restarted Hammer Film Productions as a studio. Carreras would end up heading the studio until 1980, as well as being knighted in 1970. Now, Hammer kept working on various dramas and some noir films that bordered on exploitation. However, in 1955, Hammer made The Quatermass Experiment, which turned out to be a huge success, and in quick order, lush new adaptations of Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, and a Wolfman-style tale came to pass. Hammer horror was born, and it really helped move Gothic horror into brand new levels of artistry and appreciation. And so, here we are. Unlike with the Universal Classic Horror cycle, Dracula was not the first film to launch this new era of monsters. It was flipped with Frankenstein in this case. The Curse of Frankenstein led the way in 1957. Peter Cushing was immediately a horror icon playing the Good Doctor. Christopher Lee played the monster and was immediately approached to play the Transylvanian Count. Not only that, but Cushing would play what is probably the best loved and best known and emulated version of Dr. Van Helsing the screen has ever seen. Now, the pair would star in a ridiculous amount of movies for both Hammer and their chief competitor, Amicus. Terence Fisher was brought in to direct, and he had made several movies up to this point. What's most important, though, is that he made every one of the early Hammer horror monster films. He made several of the Frankenstein films, several Dracula films, The Curse of the Werewolf, The Mummy, and The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll. Oh, and just for good measure, he also made the 1962 film version of The Phantom of the Opera. So Fisher is one of the most important figures of modern horror, as he, along with Anthony Hines producing and Lee and Cushing in front of the camera, ushered in a new age of actual monsters to be scared of when things creak and moan at night. These monsters, the skin on their faces, the blood that they drew, were all shot in glorious color for the first time, and there were no longer goofy little cartoon monsters anymore. These were for adults, and horror would never really look back from that maturity. Now, the movie begins with a fairly striking image. After the credits pan over the exterior of Castle Dracula and enters into the crypt where we see Dracula's coffin, it holds on Dracula's name, where we see large drops of bright red blood dripping and spilling over the name. And it then starts very similarly to the novel, with Jonathan Harker writing in his journal about arriving in Transylvania to meet with the enigmatic Count Dracula. And no Dracula is to be found at first, but he's met by a woman at the castle who begs for help from him. Now, upon the arrival of Dracula, the woman flees, but the Count is very well spoken and quite debonair. In a departure from the source material, Harker claims to be a librarian and not a real estate broker. And additionally, Harker is actually a vampire hunter there to kill Dracula. Additional departures from the source material, as well as several other adaptations, finds Jonathan Harker is due to wed Lucy, not Mina. Arthur Holmwood is married to Mina, and Lucy is not betrothed to Arthur, but his sister. And it's an interesting take on the original story that finds Jonathan more like kind of like a Renfield type of character at the beginning, where he's the first person to go to Dracula and he gets attacked there, whereas when we next see him, he's kind of already turned or whatever. But it's less of the Jonathan Harker as the hero and more as the first kind of sacrificial lamb. Now, I should also mention that Michael Gough is playing Arthur. And despite having been in dozens of movies and a lot of horror in the 60s and 70s, he's probably best known to a certain slice of Generation X and Millennials as being Alfred in the Batman movies that ranged from 1989 to 1997. Oh, and by the way, Harker, as I kind of mentioned, is kind of the sacrificial lamb. He is confronted again by the woman pleading for help, but she reveals herself to be a vampire and bites him. And he plans to go out in the blaze of glory by making his way to the crypt to kill the woman who bit him and then Dracula. He succeeds in killing the vampire woman, but Dracula awakes and traps Harker in the crypt to basically kill him off and turn him into a vampire. Van Helsing later arrives in the same town that Harker was really kind of last heard from. He does not find a great deal of warmth from the locals who live in constant fear of Dracula. A kindly waitress at the inn did find and save Harker's journal when it was discovered near the road. She gives it to Van Helsing, who uses it to go to Castle Dracula. He finds Harker but is forced to stake him as he's already fully transformed into a vampire and is waiting for the sun to go down to rise. Van Helsing tells the Holmwoods about Harker's death, but they refuse to allow him to see Lucy because, you see, Lucy's ill and receives strange visitors in the night. And that visitor is the very person Van Helsing is desperate to find since going missing after Harker's death. And of course, that's Count Dracula. Each day, Lucy grows weaker and weaker. Dr. Seward, who is her doctor, is treating her for anemia. But when Lucy tells Van Helsing that she's suffering from anemia, he wants to see her immediately. And he's a bit concerned about those bite marks on her neck as well. Van Helsing tells Mina some rules about making sure garlic flowers are placed by the bed, the door, and by the window. All doors and windows must remain shut and locked at all times. Lucy is ultimately driven mad by these flowers and is able to convince her maid to remove the flowers and open the door the very first night. The next morning, Lucy is dead, and Van Helsing leaves Harker's journal for Arthur to read to understand what has transpired. Now later, Arthur and Mina's daughter Tanya claims to have been led away from the house by her aunt Lucy. Arthur goes to the graveyard and he sees Lucy's tomb is empty. Lucy continues to lure Tanya away to play with her. Arthur sees Lucy and she attempts to bite him, but Van Helsing arrives just in time to burn her with a crucifix. Now Arthur now believes that Van Helsing that there's this guy named Dracula that is causing all these nightmares. But he balks at the idea of allowing Lucy to remain around to lead them to Dracula himself. He desperately wants his sister to be freed from the curse, and ultimately Van Helsing agrees for the sake of any other children that she may lead away and feed upon. While Arthur and Van Helsing investigate where Dracula's coffin may have been sent to and where they might be able to find it, a messenger boy delivers a message to Mina to have her meet her husband. Of course, this is not Arthur sending the message, but Dracula. The next morning, Mina looks pale and apparently not too miffed about Arthur needing to leave the house again to go on this chase with Van Helsing. Later, Arthur asks Mina to wear a crucifix as a favor to him, to protect her. But when he places it in her hand, it burns her, giving up the clues that Dracula has fed from her as well. Mina is visited again and is in desperate need of a blood transfusion from Arthur when they find her almost completely drained of her blood. It also means that she's running out of time, which means they need to find where Dracula is. It's discovered that Dracula has been able to get into the house despite their close watch over the place because his coffin is now in the Holmwood cellar. He steals away with Mina and rushes to his castle to get back to native soil before sunrise. Van Helsing chases him through the castle until they fight in a sitting room. Van Helsing sees that the sun has risen and tears down the curtains and forces Dracula into the sun with a cross that he makes with candlestick holders. The Count melts away to dust and the curse is lifted from Mina as well. So, all right, let's get to the three things that I like about the horror of Dracula. I should mention real quick that this movie was originally just called Dracula, but the title was changed for fear that people would confuse it with Universal's classic 1931 version. The title, though, seems to suit it even better, thanks to the color and surprising amounts of gore for 1958. In fact, let's make that my first like. The movie, like and many of the subsequent sequels, utilizes that bright red, thick blood effect that you never really saw before, mostly due to black and white. and would become a staple of horror for several decades after. It's striking and used everywhere, from the corners of the mouths to Lee's eyes when he storms in to correct the vampire girl who attacked Harker. And I see some people say that the bloodshot eyes was contact lenses that created that effect, but normally contact lenses turn the iris's color and not make your entire eyes look like they're about to explode and bleed everywhere. So, those are so dry and red that it makes my eyes itch to look at them. And as I said earlier, the movie is absolutely made for adults. This is a bloody and kind of gruesome film. I'm not sure if little kids should see this today, let alone 60 years ago. And this movie simultaneously helped bring about the start of the decline of sci-fi monsters, and along with The Curse of Frankenstein, ushered in that modern era of horror. Second, Peter Cushing is the actual lead star of this film. Act 1 and 3 is where you mostly see Christopher Lee, but Cushing provides this essence and model of calm, cool, and collected British strength. He acts purposely and is driven. And he's got to play a guy who knows something insane and unbelievable, but he's got to convince that this thing stalks the earth and preys upon the living. However, he has to act against this predator and convince others of the danger of this nearly unspeakable thing. So he plays this monster hunter with the calmness of a professional, really, and he rarely raises his voice or acts beyond a fairly even demeanor. Now, there's a particularly funny scene in which a jovial mortician is leading Arthur and Van Helsing into where Dracula's coffin is supposed to be found, and he keeps making jokes that are somewhat morbid, and is constantly slapping Van Helsing on the chest. And Cushing is just standing there stoic, but not irritated or hurrying the man. He's just letting that guy be himself while he is trying to find the most terrible monster in all the world at the same time. It's maybe one of the most understated and best scenes in the entire movie that is completely surrounded by far more memorable moments than just that scene. It's kind of amazing how much that stuck out to me. Lastly, I don't think I can go through a whole Monster Mondays without talking about how iconic Christopher Lee is in this. In his first scene, he has several lines and is perfectly debonair and classy. After we see him as a vampire, he hardly speaks again, if at all. He's just the quiet stalker and stranger that comes in the night. He strikes a terrible, imposing figure when he stands there staring at his victims while cloaked in his cape. As much as Lugosi's power was in his deep voice, Lee's power is in his stature. He's lanky and thin, looking taller than he probably actually was. Much like Karloff, Lee was a hardworking actor, having several credits already to his name, but the monster business made him a household name. And while he has not always played the villain in the movies, you could almost never look at him as anything other than someone to keep an eye on at the very least. And that's mostly because of Dracula. He owns this role and would really ultimately be the face of the character forevermore, which, for as wonderful as he was as Dracula, he lamented the typecasting that was thrust upon him because of playing the part. This is something that we'll see playing a role in how he approaches the later films that he starred in for the series, but we'll get to that here in the coming weeks. But Lee does not return for the direct sequel, Brides of Dracula, in 1960, but Peter Cushing does reprise the Van Helsing role. Next week, though, we will jump forward 8 years for the next time Dracula appears on screen with Dracula, Prince of Darkness. And this wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. Additionally, hop on over to Facebook and Twitter to follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday. So, until next week, stay spooky.